Say one thing about my YouTube channel, say that I review science fiction, fantasy, and horror novels and short stories. Today, I'm excited to finally dive into the First Law universe by Joe Abercrombie, starting with the Blade itself. Now, I have to admit, I've owned this trilogy and the standalone books in the series for years. They're actually right up there on the shelves behind me. It's one of those series that I've been meaning to read, but just never got around to it for one reason or another. Despite how many people have recommended it to me, since it was first published, really, I somehow managed to avoid any spoilers, which is kind of a miracle considering how often it's been talked about in fantasy circles. So going into this book, I was fresh with no preconceived notions, and man, was it worth the wait. The Blade itself introduces us to a fascinating cast of characters, each with their own set of flaws, motivations, and dark pasts, all set against a backdrop of a brutal and unforgiving world. At the heart of the story is Logan Ninefingers, an infamous barbarian warrior who's definitely seen better days. He's one of those characters whose luck has run out, he's lost his friends, his battles, and almost his life. Logan is constantly balancing between survival and the haunting memories of the violence he's inflicted and endured. His journey through this world is both compelling and tragic, making him a standout character right from the start. Next up, we have Captain Jazal Dan Luther. Jazal is a nobleman with more arrogance than actual skill. He's more interested in fencing, gambling, and living the good life than anything meaningful. He's the kind of character you want to dislike, and for much of the book, you probably will. His selfishness and vanity make him hard to root for, but Abercrombie is a master at taking characters like Jazal and challenging you to see them in a different light by the time the story unfolds. And then there's Sandan Glokta, the former swordsman turned crippled torturer for the Inquisition. If Jazal's vanity and Logan's brutality are enough to unsettle you, Glokta's bitterness and cynicism will take that even further. He's a man who despises the system he works for, yet excels at torturing its enemies. Glokta's physical pain and damaged psyche make him one of the more complex characters in the book, and he brings a layer of darkness that's kind of hard to look away from. And of course, the cast wouldn't be complete without Baez, the first of the Magi. Baez is shrouded in mystery throughout much of the story, leaving you to wonder if he's truly a powerful and ancient wizard or just a clever fraud manipulating everyone around him. Either way, Baez adds a level of intrigue to the plot that keeps you guessing, and his interactions with the other characters are full of tension and hidden motives. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that each of these characters they're being swept into a larger, more complex conflict. Logan, haunted by his violent past and the enemies he's made, is forced to confront the brutal reality of a war that has consumed the North. This isn't a noble, heroic war either. Abercrombie paints a picture of blood-soaked battles where survival is the only victory. Logan's journey is one of personal reckoning as much as it is about the physical struggle just to stay alive. His past catches up with him at every turn, and the harsh rules of the North are unforgiving, even for a man like Logan. In the Union, where much of the political intrigue takes place, the stakes are just as high, though often played out through conversation and manipulation rather than on the battlefield. Jazal is caught in a world of court politics where his self-absorbed nature blinds him to the larger schemes at play. His personal journey is one of privilege and arrogance, but Abercrombie uses his character to show, even though he seems to float above the chaos, he can still be dragged into its depths. Jazal may think he's just living a life of luxury, but the brewing war and the political unrest will soon force him to confront the realities outside of his comfortable circle. On the other side of the Union's power structure is Glokta, who embodies the dark, cynical nature of the system. His role as an inquisitor is to root out treason, and he excels at it, despite his own disgust for the Union's corruption. Glokta's physical pain, a constant reminder of his past, mirrors the twisted political landscape he navigates. His investigations are more than just a quest for confessions. They're a means of survival in a system that would have discarded him without a second thought. As he follows the trail of corpses and betrayals, Glocta finds himself edging closer to the rotting core of the government, where everyone has something to hide. Meanwhile, Baez looms large over the narrative, though his true intentions largely remain shrouded in mystery. His arrival sets the stage for an even greater upheaval, as his influence begins to affect the lives of Logan, Jazal, and Glocta. Now, whether Baez is truly a force for change or merely a manipulator pulling the strings of his own gain is left deliberately ambiguous, and this uncertainty, it makes his character much more intriguing. His actions suggest there's much more at play than meets the eye, and the questions of who holds the real power in this world is constantly shifting. Ultimately, what makes the Blade itself so compelling is how Abercrombie weaves these personal stories of struggle, survival, and ambition into the larger fabric of a world on the brink of chaos. The characters are all caught in their own webs of conflict, whether it's the brutal wars of the North, the treacherous politics of the Union, or the mysterious forces that Baez represents. Each of these threads, they build towards something bigger, leaving readers eager to see how these flawed, fascinating characters will collide as the stakes continue to rise. One of the most striking elements of the Blade itself is the characters. Joe Abercrombie excels at creating deeply flawed, morally complex individuals, each with their own distinct voices and perspectives. By the time you finish the book, you can identify which character is speaking just by the dialogue alone, and that's no small feat. Abercrombie's characters, they don't follow traditional archetypes of fantasy heroes or villains. They exist solely in shades of gray, and that makes them both more human and more engaging. The morally gray nature of these characters is refreshing in a genre where a lot of stories have good and evil that is clearly defined. Abercrombie takes individuals who, on the surface, are deeply unlikable, be it through arrogance, brutality, or sheer cynicism, and somehow makes you care about them. Logan Ninefingers, for example, is a barbarian with a violent past and a reputation that would make most readers wary, yet Abercrombie writes him in a way that highlights the tragedy behind his choices. Logan is constantly haunted by the violence he's inflicted, and there's a vulnerability to him that peeks through the cracks of his hardened exterior. This balance between brutality and introspection makes Logan one of the standout characters of the novel. Then you have someone like Captain Jazal, who at first glance seems to be the stereotypical arrogant nobleman, more concerned with the fencing skills he's developing and his social standing than anything of real substance. In many other books, Jazal might be a character you love to hate, and again, while that's certainly true for most of the story, Abercrombie manages to inject enough depth into his character arc where you find yourself curious to see where his journey is going to lead. Jazal's growth, or lack thereof, becomes a crucial part of the story's appeal. As Abercrombie, he's constantly playing with the reader's expectations. And of course, we can't talk about complex characters without mentioning Sandan Glocta. He's both memorable and multifaceted, and quite frankly, one of the best in the genre. Glocta is a former swordsman turned torturer, and he's bitter and broken from the physical and emotional pain he's endured. His chapters are some of the most fascinating because they offer a window into a mind that is as sharp as it is twisted. Glocta's inner monologues are laced with sarcasm and bitterness, and they're often at odds with the words he speaks aloud, and this constantly gives him and his character a layer of complexity. Abercrombie has crafted someone who is both terrifying and pitiable. He's a man you shouldn't root for, but you can't help but being captivated by. His physical pain and his disillusionment with the corrupt system he works for makes him a fascinating lens through which we view the darker side of this world. But Abercrombie doesn't stop with just a main cast. Logan's crew of the named men like Three Trees and Dogman, they're just as well developed, even though they play smaller roles in the first book. Each character feels fully realized with their own motivations and personalities that leap off of the page. The camaraderie and tension with Logan's crew adds a layer to the story, making these side characters just as compelling as the leads. It's rare, truly, it's rare to find a book where even the secondary characters are as fleshed out and memorable, but Abercrombie somehow manages to pull it off. Another thing that makes the Blade itself stand out is Abercrombie's ability to subvert expectations in a way that feels natural and never forced. Too often in modern fiction, authors attempt to shock readers by going against the grain, and it can feel contrived. Here, however, every twist and turn in the plot feels earned. Abercrombie plays with familiar fantasy tropes, setting up the reader to expect a particular outcome, only to take the story in an entirely different direction. Yet these surprises never come at the expense of the story or the characters. Instead, they enhance the narrative, keeping the reader on their toes and ensuring that nothing is ever predictable. And one of the best examples of this subversion is the way Abercrombie handles traditional ideas of heroism and villainy. In many fantasy stories, characters are driven by clear moral codes, but in the Blade itself, that line is blurred. Characters like Logan and Glocta have done terrible things, yet they also show moments of vulnerability and humanity. On the flip side, seemingly noble figures like Jezal are far more selfish and shallow than we're initially led to believe. This constant re-examination of who the characters really are keeps the story engaging and adds a layer of unpredictability that makes it stand out in the crowded fantasy genre. And Abercrombie's dialogue, it deserves every praise it gets. It's sharp, it's witty, and it's full of dark humor, which gives the book a sense of levity despite how often the content is just harsh and brutal. The banter between characters feel organic, and the humor, while black, keeps the story from becoming overly bleak. In a world as grim as the one Abercrombie has created, these moments of humor are vital, balancing the darker themes and making the characters feel all the more real. Abercrombie's knack for capturing the nuances of human interaction, especially in tense and dire situations, makes the dialogue one of the book's standout features. Ultimately, what makes the Blade itself great isn't the plot or the world building, because, let's face it, the plot in the book feels more like an expanded prologue, and the world building, while good, isn't the primary focus. The reason is that this is a page-turner is 100% the characters. Abercrombie's ability to craft such richly detailed and morally ambiguous individuals is what sets his book apart from so many others in the genre. Even when the plot slows down or the action takes a backseat, it's the characters that keep you hooked. They drive the story forward and make you want to know what happens next. This deep focus on characters is the heart of the Blade itself. It's what makes it such a memorable and rewarding read. If you're tired of the same old good versus evil fantasy stories where heroes and villains fit neatly into their roles, the Blade itself is going to give you something refreshingly different. In most traditional fantasies, we expect clear lines. You have your virtuous protagonist battling the corrupt villains. There's the quest to save the world, and a sense of moral clarity guiding the character's actions. But here, Abercrombie takes all of those familiar tropes and just throws them out the window. What you get instead is a world populated by damaged, morally ambiguous characters who feel more like real people than typical fantasy archetypes. They're complex and often selfish and sometimes downright brutal, but that's precisely what makes them so compelling. You'll find yourself rooting for characters who, by all accounts, shouldn't be easy to root for. Logan Ninefingers, a man responsible for countless deaths, is a savage warrior haunted by his past, but Abercrombie still makes you sympathize with him as he struggles with his violent nature. Glocta, a torturer who uses his wit and cruelty as weapons, is undeniably ruthless, yet you can't help but admire his sharp mind and sardonic sense of humor. Even Jezal, whose vanity and arrogance should make him utterly detestable, becomes a character you want to see grow, even if he doesn't necessarily deserve it. Abercrombie's genius is in how he forces readers to confront these conflicting emotions, making you question why you care about these characters and why, against all odds, you're invested in their stories. Even if you find the plot slower in the first book, with much of the focus on introducing these characters, I encourage you to stick with it. This is a series that takes its time building the world and its inhabitants, but these introductions are crucial. Abercrombie is laying the groundwork for something bigger, and everything might seem like minor character development or slow pacing in the Blade itself pays off in a huge way as the trilogy progresses. By the time you reach the second and third books, you'll realize that every interaction, every subtle detail was leaning to something more meaningful. One of the key reasons the Blade itself works so well is Abercrombie's mastery of blending grimdark elements with dark, twisted humor. Grimdark as a genre can often feel like an endless descent into despair, where characters and the world is just stripped of all hope. And while the Blade itself certainly doesn't shy away from the brutality and violence that define grimdark, it never falls into complete nihilism. Abercrombie manages to balance the grim tone with humor that feels authentic to the characters and the situations they find themselves in. The humor isn't there to undercut the seriousness of the narrative, but rather to give the characters and the readers a brief reprieve from the relentless bleakness of their world. This dark humor often emerges from the interactions between the characters, whether it's Logan's weary acceptance of his fate, Glocta's biting sarcasm, or the banter between Logan's crew of Northmen. These moments of levity keep the story from becoming overwhelming. They give the reader room to breathe amid the chaos. Abercrombie's wit shines through his dialogue, which is sharp, memorable, and full of lines you'll find yourself quoting long after you've finished the book. Even in the midst of the most brutal scenes, Abercrombie finds a way to inject a bit of dry humor that makes the characters and the world feel that much more real. If you're looking for a fantasy series that challenges the traditional notions of heroism and morality, The Blade itself is a perfect starting point. The book forces you to grapple with flawed, often unlikable characters who still manage to captivate you. It's a story where the line between hero and villain is constantly blurred, and that ambiguity is what makes the narrative so engaging. Abercrombie doesn't hand you easy answers, and that's part of the book's appeal. It makes you think, it makes you question, and it keeps you invested. And finally, if you enjoy character-driven stories where the internal conflicts of the protagonists are just as important as the external ones, this is a must-read. Abercrombie excels at creating characters who feel fully realized, with personal struggles that extend far beyond the central plot. They have lives, histories, and emotional baggage that makes them feel authentic. Their relationships, whether alliances, rivalries, or grudging friendships, are often built on a foundation of complex, often conflicting motivations that make every interaction feel loaded with meaning. This depth of character development is what makes The Blade itself separate so much from many other fantasy books. In the end, what makes The Blade itself a standout read is the way it combines rich character development, dark humor, and a subversion take on fantasy tropes. If you've been searching for a series that defies expectations and offers something new, while still delivering on the action, political intrigue, and world building you love in epic fantasy, this is the book for you. Abercrombie's debut novel sets the stage for one of the most unique and compelling fantasy series in modern times, and it all starts here. The Blade itself is such a breath of fresh air. For years, I owned this trilogy in the standalone books, but I always put off reading them, thinking that no series could really measure up to A Song of Ice and Fire. I couldn't have been more wrong. This book opened my eyes to the fact that there is incredible character-driven storytelling right under my nose, and Joe Abercrombie's work sits at the top of that list. What sets this series apart is how Abercrombie pushes the boundaries of what I expect from fantasy. The complex, morally gray characters and the dark humor, and the sharp, unpredictable writing all combine to create something unique. This book raised the bar for me. From the moment I finished it, I found myself expecting the same level of depth and originality in every fantasy series I pick up after. If you're new to the series, or you found yourself unsure after reading The Blade itself, I can't stress this enough. Stick with it. The first book introduces the characters and it sets the stage, but the sequels expand on everything that makes this world and its inhabitants so compelling. The twists, the growth, and the development that follow are worth the investment. For anyone looking for something different, something more in their fantasy, this series is a must read. And that's it for today's video. This is a bit of a longer one, so if you made it this far, I thank you for taking this journey with me. If you could please like, subscribe, and leave a comment, it would be a big help in growing this channel. And until next time, happy reading.